Hi, good afternoon. So I'm here to talk with you today about the practice of pleasure. And my brief was to talk about, in my work, how I help people to experience more pleasure. So I was going to do that by sharing a little bit about who I am, what I do, and I call myself a sex, pleasure and intimacy coach. So I'm going to talk about why I use pleasure so explicitly in my job title. I'm going to share with you something I've developed called the performance to pleasure model, and then I'm going to just share with you some client stories to illustrate, they're the best way to illustrate this for sure. So, who am I? So, I work as a sex, pleasure and intimacy coach, but this was not something that I had shared with me at career service or ever thought I was going to be in my teenage years or 20s for sure. And I got into this work because I realised at the age of 29 I had some challenges in this area of my life. I hated my body, I thought my genitals were deformed, I was terrified of sex and I didn't quite know why. I didn't even know what I wanted when it came to pleasure, and I certainly didn't know how to communicate or ask, or that I even had a right to that. And I was approaching my 30th birthday, and often as big birthdays do, they raise questions in our lives about how things are going. And I just knew that I had to do something about it, but I was incredibly scared. And I knew that for me, going to a therapist or a doctor just didn't feel like the appropriate channel. And this was 15 years ago, so there's not very many places to go to. I mean, even now there isn't enough places. And I went to Waterstones and found a book on sex on the shelf, and ended up doing some browsing on the internet and found there was a women's sexuality workshop in Ormskirk, of all places, just down the road. And I booked myself on it for my 30th birthday present, and actually it was just life-changing. And here I am 15 years later, stood here talking to you guys, and it's been the most sort of incredible exploration. So I was the first certified professional sex coach in the UK a number of years ago. And I describe myself as a coach, teacher, sexologist and educator, because I'm going to talk about how education is so much of what I do. And sexologist, I'm just fascinated by sex. I mean, what an amazing subject to explore and discover and learn about. For me, I've done a lot of training in all sorts of different areas. So I've gone and studied things like Tantra and Taoist and sort of Eastern esoteric traditions, but also modern day sexology, and really blending the old and the new together, the ancient wisdoms and the modern wisdoms. And I help people to love their sexual selves, because for so many people they feel guilt, shame, all sorts of things around their sex, their sexuality. And so helping people to reconnect and own and love that part of themselves. And also what I find, and I'll talk to you about this as well, is that when we address this area of our lives, the benefits ripple out into the rest of our lives as well. Because often if we've got sexual problems, we might, for me certainly, I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought that I was the only one that was experiencing this, and I had so much shame around it that it really affected my confidence in all aspects of my life. So I find that if we can address this area, it can unlock our potential in all sorts of areas. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what sex coaching is, because it's a relatively new area, and this quote comes, I think, from Dr. Patty. Dr. Patty wrote the book, The Art of Sex Coaching, and I knew when I wanted to train in this area that for me the therapeutic approach was not the route I wanted to go down, and when I read Dr. Patty's book it was just like, that's what I want to do. And Dr. Patty was one of the first people to coin the phrase sex coaching, and there was also another woman called Betty Dodson, you might know her from her work around masturbation. She's 87, 89, still running workshops on masturbation in America, amazing woman. And Dr. Patty, she says that sex coaching is a derivative of sexology, approaching the client relationship from the methodologies and style of life coaching. So it's a weave of those areas. And it's a growing area, so you've got generic sex coaches who work across lots of different sexual problems, and then you've got niche sex coaches, so it may be that they specialise in working with BDSM and kink communities, or working with women over a certain age, so you've got growing niches. And you've also got a growing professionalisation, because anybody can call themselves a sex coach, just as anyone can call themselves a sex therapist. And obviously, especially when it comes to this area, you want to know that you're going to somebody who has training, who has supervision and professional development, who has insurance, follows a code of ethics, all of these sort of things. And so there's organisations like the World Association of Sex Coaches that have been set up and that are raising standards in the field. And just to give you a little sense of the growth of sex coaching, Dr. Patty did a search Google in 2010, and the search sex coach got 87 responses. A few years later, Dr. Patty and I wrote an article for the Journal of Sex and Relationship Therapy about sex coaching. There was nearly 500,000. And I just did this a couple of weeks ago, and I actually don't know how to say all those numbers, but it just gives you an indication of the huge rise. And really, if you look at the number of life coaches, it's surprising there aren't more sex coaches actually, and I just feel the profession's just going to grow and grow. It's really it's an exciting time to be involved. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of the key elements of sex coaching, because often when people look at sex coaching and talk about it, they talk about how is it different than therapy, and I don't think it's helpful to get into a conversation of sex coaching versus sex therapy, because I think there's absolutely a place for all of these. We haven't got enough people helping people with sexual problems in the world. We need a lot more. And so and a lot of good sex coaching and good sex therapy, there's a lot of overlap, and we all have the same goals of helping clients, but there's some things that distinguish sex coaching to sex therapy. So I think one thing that's super important, and speakers have talked about this already today, is the use of non-medical language. So for example, I wouldn't talk to a client, I would not use the term having a erectile dysfunction, because that immediately puts the situation in a medical perspective. And so, for example, I might use the words erection challenges or an issue around erections. And so it's using neutral language that's that's very sex positive as well. And so, for example, I might talk about assessments and action plans rather than diagnosing and treatment plans. So there's a difference. And I know some sex therapists struggle with the language that can be there as well. For me, education is the foundation. So all the sex coaches that I know of have been on very in-depth and personal journeys looking at their own relationship to their sexuality and who they are as sexual beings. And again, speakers have spoke about this already today. And so, for example, as a sex coach, I had to go on something called a SAR, which is a sexual attitude restructuring program. And it was a 4 or 5 day event, and they happen around the world, and I went out to Amsterdam, and for those few days you're exposed to all sorts of aspects of human sexuality. We spoke to sex workers and people doing BDSM, we went to clubs, we were exposed to media, all sorts of different things, so that we can bring up what elements are triggering for us, or maybe that we're uncomfortable with, and have discussions around that, as well as being able to just see the range of what is out there. So things like that are really important. And personalised sex education is absolutely at the foundation. It's such a core part of sex coaching, because, as again Sean was speaking about, we have had no sex education. You know, if I was to give you the keys of a car for you to drive without any lessons, you'd have a problem. And you know, it's bizarre that we are not taught how our bodies, how our pleasure work in any decent way. So sex education is so key. And I'm also interested in not just how to have okay sex and intimacy. I'm interested in what is truly possible, because in our culture we're taught such a limited slice of what is possible for our bodies and our pleasure. And so I'm really interested in how do we create really amazing, fulfilling sex lives, whatever that means to the person. That's absolutely self-defined. But also people often come to me saying, I don't know what I don't know. What else is there to learn, to explore? Often people think of it in terms of more and more adventures and being out there and sex toys and all sorts of things, and that's great, but there's also, and there's a place for that, but there's also how do we have more pleasure and get to know our bodies more intimately. So I'm going to talk about that. And nowadays there's a lot of pioneering somatic approaches that are coming through in terms of sex coaching. So I just want to give you a little flavour, because I think as you're starting out in this area, it's really good to know what's out there. So in terms of somatic, so there's just to backtrack, so in terms of coaching, there is talk-based coaching. So for example, you might use things like cognitive behavioural therapy, NLP, mindfulness approaches, but then there's a growing area of what's known as somatic or sometimes experiential coaching. And there's different layers of this, and some people may focus on one layer, some people may work across all. I've certainly worked across all in my time. So talk-based coaching is where somatic practices, somatic being of the body, are foundational. So it might be things like breath, body awareness, how connected are we to our feelings and our sensations. We also have something called observational body work. So that might be, for example, guiding a couple to touch each other. That can be clothes on, it can be clothes off, all sorts of different things, but guiding them to touch each other where they're having an experience of touch and communication together. It can be something like masturbation coaching, where you're watching a client masturbating to help the client to overcome sexual problems. So for example, if somebody's struggling with a lot of tension in their body, or for example, if they're having problems around ejaculation, but talk coaching hasn't helped them, something like this can really help. There's also hands-on, clothes-on work. So I say there's a modality called somatica by two amazing sex therapists in America called Celeste and Danielle, who I highly recommend. And they've developed a model of how do we work with clients with a clothes-on way to help them to engage with their bodies and pleasure to learn. You know, because if you're going to learn to play the piano, you don't go and sit with a teacher, talk about it, write notes, and then go home and try and practice it. It just doesn't work. So this somatic area that's growing is giving people experiences that they can really understand what's happening and learn. So for example, you have a single man who feels very nervous towards women because of past experiences or whatever. He may try working with the practitioner. How is it to move towards a woman, to touch her, to look her in the eyes? So very practical things which are incredibly empowering, and I've seen such incredible breakthroughs with clients doing this. And also Betty Martin that Sian mentioned, she's developed a whole load of little games, like there's the one called the 3-minute game, where you take turns asking for what you want for 3 minutes. So I might play that with my clients, where we just do that with touching our hands. And I've had people have life-changing breakthroughs, just realizing that actually they're entitled to ask for pleasure, or they maybe have never asked for anything in their whole lives. And in that session, they're enabled, they have the space to be able to ask for something. And in asking that, something shifts profoundly for them. There's also hands-on work where clients may have clothes off. So for example, there's modalities like sexological bodywork, which is something I've trained in, and I'm now on the teaching team with. So sexological bodywork can include all of these above. It's absolutely talking and observational bodywork. But I'll give you an example of, again, a client, say for example, a man who is having challenges with ejaculating, and talking therapy or talking coaching is not working. Having an opportunity to work with a practitioner with a strict code of ethics and boundaries. The practitioner is fully clothed and wears gloves for genital contact, but the practitioner holds the space for the client to explore his arousal, and in that situation, he can learn so much more faster in terms of understanding what's happening in his body and why he's ejaculating quickly. And if he hasn't got a partner, for example, then it's a way of overcoming that. Because I've worked with many people who have avoided intimacy because of their sexual problems, and they don't know, how do I ever overcome ejaculation control for ejaculation challenges, for example, and I don't have a partner, but I'm not going to have a partner because I don't want to experience this. So what happens? I had a client come to me recently and was told by a therapist because he was single, they weren't able to help him. And you know, that's just not good enough. It's like, so there's this growing area of practitioners that are helping people in a more embodied way. Then you've got hands-on two-way touch, which is something which you would commonly think of as sexual surrogacy, where somebody works with their body to offer the client an experience of practicing. So for example, somebody who maybe has, like virgin clients who've never kissed somebody. You know, I've worked with virgins that are in their 50s, 60s, and they may have come to somebody like me as a last resort. And so they may be too terrified to go out dating, but they might work with somebody like a surrogate to practice what it's like to sit with another person and be naked. What's it like to hold hands with somebody else? What's it like to kiss? And it may even involve, with some people, penetration. And that's more traditionally within a therapeutic model. So you may have a surrogate there's a client, a surrogate and a therapist holds the space. So there's places like ICASA that specialise in this. And it's a really important and valid area. So, and just a little bit about why I think somatic sessions are really important is because as a practitioner, I'm able to evaluate very quickly what's happening in the client's body. And I have learned time and time again that what a client says and what they actually do are two different things. So for example, a client might say, I'm going very slowly, or I'm breathing well, or I'm relaxed. And actually when we go to a somatic session, it's an entirely different picture. It enables me to make more effective interventions because I can see the baseline. If I'm a football coach and I'm watching somebody play football, I'm going to be able to help them improve their football game much easier by watching them and seeing what's happening than again talking about it. And research shows that we learn best by doing. So it makes a difference in that way, but it's not for everybody at all. And I certainly do a risk assessment when I'm speaking to a client about that aspect of the work. But I just want to share with you that because it's a growing area in the world, and I think it's a really important and valuable area. So sex coaching, just moving on, also is very present focused, moving towards the future. So, you know, with therapy, it might be looking back at family of origin issues and different things. So I might have somebody phone up and after a conversation, I feel that a therapeutic approach is better first, and then they might come back to somebody like myself. And then sex coaching is also very holistic. So I like this quote, coaching emphasizes a wellness-focused, client-centered, results-orientated style of working towards a client's goals. So it's a focus on wellness, it's a focus on empowerment, and it includes their whole life, and I'm going to talk about pleasure. And so the four core elements are, when I'm working with a client, I'm identifying what their goals are, what their blocks are, what their opportunities are for learning and growth. Then we've got an element of coaching, an element of education, and an element of practice, and all three of those are absolutely key. So why pleasure coaching? So I very explicitly use the word pleasure in my job title because I feel it's so important. For me, I was brought up in a family where it was the Protestant work ethic. You work really hard all your life, and then when you get to the future, then you can relax and enjoy life once you've saved money and all these different things. And it was like pleasure was always deferred. So I just didn't really know how to fully enjoy pleasure. And so for me, I've been on a whole journey unraveling my relationship with pleasure. And so I really love to help my clients explore that as well, because I find it makes a real difference. And we've got a culture where pleasure is very much perceived as, clients often say to me, what's the point in pleasure? There's no tangible outcome. Yeah, they just don't know how to relax and switch off and enjoy pleasure. It's seen as something indulgent and hedonistic. And often they feel very guilty when they experience pleasure as well. So it can come with a whole range of different things. And what I find is that when we develop our pleasure capacity, you could see it like bandwidth, okay? So if we look at it, we may be able, because of our upbringing, we might only be able to experience this much pleasure. We might actually be able to experience very little. That might be for all sorts of reasons, from trauma to our upbringing, many different reasons. But it limits our capacity to experience pleasure. So what myself and people like Sean and Nick are doing is we're helping clients to expand how they can experience pleasure in their lives. And part of that for me is really helping clients understand the benefits of pleasure, because as we're talking about in terms of oxytocin, when we experience pleasure, we are activating all the feel-good hormones in the body. And for many people, they're walking around with just day-to-day stress hormones. And there's an amazing piece of research that won the Nobel Prize a few years ago called the telomeres effect. And telomeres are little caps on the chromosomes of our DNA. And when we are in stress, those caps shrivel and shrink and actually affect our chance of longevity in this life. But when we're in the pleasure cycle of our hormones, those chromosomes caps, they grow and expand. So it's literally, science is saying that pleasure is good for us. And so I work with clients, because if clients can't experience pleasure in the day-to-day, then they're really going to have a challenge experiencing it in the bedroom. So we might start by looking at pleasure in the rest of their lives. So this is some of the things that I will typically explore with a client. It's not an exclusive list, but just to give you a flavour. I'm looking at their relationship to pleasure, how they were raised around pleasure, their pleasure story, their beliefs, the messages that they've had. I'm looking at their boundaries, so we talked about consent. And I find that people, when I work with, that find pleasure a challenge, often don't have healthy boundaries. So for example, they might be people that always put other people first, or they can't say no. I'm looking at pleasure day to day. Are they able to just take a moment and enjoy the sun on their face? Are they able to enjoy the food that they're eating? Do they take time out to look after themselves for self-care and pleasure, whatever that may look like? I'm looking at the relationship to their body and how aware they are of their body in terms of sensations and feelings. I'm looking at how they measure pleasure, because often people, when it comes to sex, will define pleasure as in terms of the orgasm, but they don't enjoy the journey up to the orgasm so much. And even the orgasm, when we start to unpick it and examine it, actually might not be that pleasurable. And also obviously looking at how, do they know how to turn themselves on? Do they know actually what they want? And are they able to communicate that? So these are some of the things that I'll be exploring. So through my work with clients, I've developed something called the performance to pleasure model. And I've got this picture of the painting pad here, because I had a client phone me up before Christmas and he said, how I do sex is like painting by numbers. I do one, then I go to number 2, number 3. It's very linear. And this approach was one of the reasons his most recent relationship had finished. And he said, I want to learn to be freer with sex. I want to learn to go off piste. So we had a giggle around this. But I really like the analogy of the painting by numbers. So the performance to pleasure model is something that I work with every client. It helps them to overcome sexual problems, but also helps them to increase the amount of pleasure that they experience. And I've also developed something called the erotic toolkit, which I'm going to talk about, which is the practical application of this. And just a little bit, and it's been said a bit before today, you know, how we learn sex is often our first sexual experiences might be masturbation, and often that can be quickly and quietly under the covers because we don't want to get caught. Obviously porn and the movies gives us a very limited snapshot of how our sexual experiences can be. And so when we learn sex in the performance model, this is how we often learn it, the conventional way of sex. I want to say there's nothing wrong with it, but it's just if it's the only thing. If we only have pizza for tea every day, it's sure going to get boring quickly. We want some variety. So the conventional sort of performance-based sex, and this is what I see all the time with the clients that I work with, it's somehow that we have wired up that if we're in a heterosexual relationship, successful sex equals man has an erection, ejaculates when he wants, woman has an orgasm, and ideally both of them have an orgasm at the same time, and if that doesn't happen, somehow it's not quite successful sex. And I see this all the time with the people that I work with. And so we focus on what I call goal-orientated sex, where the goal is, for example, having to have an erection, having to have an orgasm. And when our attention is on the goal, we cannot fully enjoy the experience in front of us because we've always got one eye on what needs to happen next. And when we do that, our attention is either in the future, what do I do next to get to this place, or it's in the past, we may be worrying, or when I did it last time it didn't work, or I lost my erection last time, or I was worrying about am I doing it right, all these common inner dialogues that people have around their sexual experience. The performance model is often very tension-based. As we increase the pleasure in the body, then the body, you know, the typical clenching of the fists and curling of the toes that creates tension in the body. And with that, we often get to shallow breathe. We maybe even hold our breath. Often the mouth and the jaw is clamped and the body can be quite rigid. With the performance model, we have a sort of hierarchy of pleasure, that faster and intense pleasure is seen as better than slower pleasure. Okay, so if you had a 1 to 10 pleasure scale, with 10 being the most pleasure and 1 being the least pleasure, it's like we want to be in that 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, that's what happens in porn. They get up to the 7, 8, 9, 10 and go harder, faster in general. And if you saw it in terms of temperature, it's like we want to be in the hot realms, we don't want to hang out in the cooler or the warmer realms. It's also very generously focused in the performance model, and again, nothing wrong with that. It can feel absolutely great, but again, if that's just the only way, it's often what we sometimes call external routes to pleasure, so it's looking to the person you're with or something outside of you to promote the arousal. It's often performing. You know, people say to me commonly, I think I should be doing it this way. They have ideas about how sex should be from what they've learnt. Also, telepathic sex, this idea that we should just know what to do for our partners and they should know what to do for us, with no communication. And this is where it becomes, you know, often people will phone me and say sex has become routine, mechanical, functional, and it's because they're sat in this performance model and that's the only thing that they're doing, whether it's solo sex or whether it's partnered sex. So, what's possible? So I talk about the pleasure model, okay, because it refocuses our attention. The orientation is pleasure, and it doesn't matter whether the pleasure's a 2 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, just enjoy the pleasure. And that can bring fun back, because often the fun's taken out when we're in that goal model because we're so worried about what's going to be happening. The focus is on the present experience. So what's happening in the moment? What's happening in my body? What am I feeling? What are the sensations that are there? If we're in our minds in the past or the future, we can't fully enjoy the sensations, because often it's subtle sensations that we're missing because we're not paying any attention. It's relaxation based. So when we're in the performance model, we activate the sympathetic nervous system mostly. When we're in the pleasure model, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more about relaxation, okay? And it's not that we're going to be exclusively there, we'll move between all of them. We need both of them in our sexual experiences, but we're not going to be stuck in the sympathetic nervous system. And when we're in the relaxation-based nervous system, we're cultivating more of the feel-good hormones. And when we're relaxed, there's a term called relaxed arousal, so that we use the breath and sound and movement to help build our arousal in a positive way. So we might take some deep breaths, our jaws relax, we might make some sound. It's amazing how many people do not make any sound. And I'm not talking about making a lot of noise, it's just the jaws relax and Sometimes things like that alone, just the breath and the relaxing the jaw, can solve a sexual challenge that somebody's having, just that alone. We move the body, it's more relaxed. And I've mentioned here transitions because I see with people so many times that they expect to just show up in the bedroom and that will make them relaxed. But actually, when we're in the busy doing modes, we know our culture's so busy all the time, we might need to do things to switch off to get us more into a mode of wanting to have any pleasure or intimacy. So for some people that might look like having a shower, some people that might look like having time chatting to their partners. For others it might be taking time out away from their partners. It might be making sure your emails are finished, whatever it is. But what is it that you need to do to help you to switch off and relax? And that alone I've seen can be a game changer for many people. Take a leaf out of this guy's book and it's about slowing down. So what I would say is, we rush our pleasure, and having worked somatically for a long period of time, I see how fast we are with our pleasure. And so slowing down, and one of my favourite words is savouring. It's enjoying every moment of pleasure and really allowing ourselves to do that rather than rushing for what we think is the end goal. And what I say to people is, rather than seeing pleasure as a hierarchy on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being the best, let's flip it onto its side and let's see it as a spectrum so that we can enjoy the full experience. And that actually will allow us to have better arousal, because we can go with our body's full natural intelligence rather than like rushing to the end game. Again, this alone, slowing down, can just change people's sexual experience. But again, we don't have a reference point, because you never see somebody having slow or warm sex in the movies. It's always super fast. Whole body pleasure. So I say to clients, the lips, the nipples, the genitals, and then we have our secondary and tertiary erogenous zones. So for example, the nape of the neck, the backs of the knees, the crease at the bottom of your buttocks, the soles of the feet. But it's like, I don't even give people a list, because people have come back to me and gone, oh my God, I didn't know how pleasurable my ankles were, or, you know, all sorts of things. It's like, go and explore. And what I found is if you're not experiencing pleasure in those different areas of your body, it's just because often you've not paid any attention to them. And overdoing them, giving them attention, it's like the sensory receptors come alive and you can feel more and more. Also, we've heard today the term erotic self-sufficiency, you know, because if we're wanting telepathic sex and wanting our partner to know how to please us, that's going to limit our sexual experience. But if I know my body and my pleasure well and I can articulate that, and my partner knows their body and pleasure well and they can articulate that, then we're going to create a very different sexual experience. So we have to take responsibility for knowing about our bodies and our pleasure. And then when we are connected to the sensations and the feelings in our body, then we're going to enhance and expand the experience that we can have. It's about being authentic as well. You know, so often people I work with fit in a box of how they think their sexuality should look or what's expected of them. And it's about finding what's true for you. I have something called the sexual expression wheel, which has got all these different ways we can express our sexual personalities that I go through with my clients. So what feels true for you? And that might change. We're always evolving. We're growing as sexual beings all the time. But being true to what feels, you know, it might be today we feel really sensual. Tomorrow we might feel really kinky. In 5 minutes we might feel kinky, and then we might feel like we just want to be in a more comforting, cuddling place. So our sexual expression ebbs and flows and changes. So if we can really get to know that, we're going to create a very different sexual experience. And then also great communication. You know, I really echo what Sian said. Really rate Betty Martin's work. But many people I work with don't have a language to express what's happening for themselves. So often people know what they don't want, but they don't know what they do want. And even if they do know what they do want, they don't know how to communicate that in a positive, generative way. So for example, people might say to somebody, don't do that, or I don't like that, but that can get into a situation where somebody maybe feels criticized, even though that wasn't the intention. So it's how do we find language to say, I love this, and I'd love it if you just went a bit slower, or would you mind, let's try a bit faster, or when you're giving pleasure, getting some feedback, how does that feel? You know, because I think this myth that we should just know, we have to, is one of the biggest myths that affects our sexual experiences. And so when I work with people, I say, you know, if you've got a band that have turned up at the Manchester Evening News Arena, they have put in hours of practice to produce that amazing show. Yet we're just expected to turn up in the bedroom every single time and put a fantastic show on without any practice. So whether you're individuals or you're in relationships, to create time for practice is fantastic, and particularly for partners, because if you create practice time, it takes away the expectation of having to get it right and having to do well, and you can have some fun. What's it like to explore massage? How does your body feel today? Let's explore different types of touch. You know, how is it to do things? There's amazing things you can practice. One of my favourite games of Betty's is called Bossy Massage, where you take an allotted amount of time to ask for what you want. So it might look like we have 15 minutes each, and in that 15 minutes I can ask for whatever I want. And if I get bored with it or I don't like it when it's happening, I can just ask for something else and change it. But what's really great about this is, in relationship, you could play this game forever and never get bored, because it gets you out of the habits and patterns that we very easily get into in our sexual experiences. Because if I'm going to go into a restaurant, you know, I'm not going to choose my partner's food and expect them to choose my food. I'm going to look at the menu and go, what do I feel like today? Actually, today I fancy something veggie, or today I fancy fish. So if we bring that curiosity to our pleasure, we're going to have a very different experience, which leads me on to the next one, which is just bringing that beginner's mind. You know, how is my body today? What does it want? Not what do I think it wants, or what do I expect it to want, or what I feel it should want, but what's actually true for me today. So if we bring that curiosity and that sense of exploration, we're again going to create very different sexual experiences. And when people come to me, they'll often say, I would like to know 10 different techniques that are going to make me the most amazing lover. And for me, techniques is around 10% of it. Because if we're really connected to our bodies and we really trust the wisdom of our bodies, they just know what to do and they'll guide us in the most amazing ways. But for many of us, that's a practice to really listen and connect to our bodies for all sorts of different reasons. That's a whole nother presentation. So I just want to finish with some client examples because I think they illustrate this the best. So Sam was losing his erections when he came to me. He actually came to me, and when I spoke to him, he just sobbed on the phone. He was absolutely at breaking point with it. He did not know what to do, where to go. And he was becoming more withdrawn and close from his partner. And he just didn't know what he wanted. He hadn't any sense of what sexually he might like. So we explored lots of things, and one of the most significant breakthroughs was that he had a very angry father. And because of his angry father, he had totally rejected anything he perceived to be masculine, and that for him was a man initiating sex and leading in a sexual situation. So he just put all of that aside. We busted some of the myths because his erections were going. He had an expectation that as a man he should have an erection all the time during his sexual experience. But our pleasure ebbs and flows, so erections can come and go, and that's totally natural. He also thought that in a long-term relationship, sex should just happen, and if it didn't, there was something up with him. So we explored the performance to pleasure model, and we also explored what would it be like for him to follow what was pleasurable for him. So if he saw his partner and he felt that he wanted to grab her and give her a hug, or say she looked in this way, that actually that's okay for him to do that. And I find working with men around erections, there's a significant group of men that censor their sexual experiences, which results in their erections not working in the way that they would like. And so he started to practice following his impulses and following them on a day-to-day level, just the little things, as well as starting to do that in the bedroom. And now his wife says he's an absolutely different man. This is just a thing of the past, and he occasionally doesn't have an erection, but it just doesn't bother him. He knows that it's absolutely fine. And it's amazing how his confidence has totally transformed. So in work, he actually didn't feel his opinions mattered. And now, because of the work we were doing together, he started to voice little things in the workplace and found that actually people were interested in what he had to say. And so it's led to this mushrooming in his career as well. So it's really affected him on every level. And he's a really different person. A couple, Ben and Karen, very common situation. Young child, Karen's saying she doesn't feel in the mood, she's feeling pressured. The guy's feeling rejected, and it's causing a lot of stress, and they've just got stuck in a rut around this dynamic when they approach me. So again, we looked at some of the myths, and one of the myths that Karen was carrying was that she should just feel desire, and if she's not feeling desire and pleasure and wanting pleasure, there's something up with her. And I highly recommend Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are. And in this book, Emily talks about the difference between spontaneous desire and responsive desire. So spontaneous desire is when we just feel desire, it just happens. We see something in the street and we just have this sense of desire. Whereas what the research is showing, and it's quite in its infancy, is that for people identifying as a male gender, spontaneous desire is the most common way they experience desire. Whereas for those identifying as women, it's more responsive, and a mix of responsive and spontaneous. So responsive desire is, I'm not feeling any desire, but if my partner seduces me, I might start to feel some desire. Or if we start to have a lovely cuddle or a touch, I might start to feel some desire. So I need something to happen to respond to. So when Karen heard this was an absolute revelation, because she realised there was a couple of times where they'd gone to have some sexual intimacy and she didn't want to, but once they got into it, she really enjoyed it. So that alone changed everything. We explored the performance to pleasure model, and they realised they were not spending time on pleasure, it was all about performance. And then Karen was able to voice what she needed around feeling pleasure. We looked at what Emily Nagoski calls the brakes and accelerators. So what are the things that put the brakes on your sexual experience, and what are the things that accelerate your sexual experience and your pleasure? So for example, a brake might be that you can't relax because you've got lots of thoughts, but it could be that the room's cold and you want to have a hot room to be able to relax and enjoy your pleasure. So there can be different brakes and accelerators. So we explored that together. So if we look up brakes and accelerators and we find what are the key accelerators, then we can create situations where we have more of those. And we also looked at the sexual expression wheel and sharing desires and things like bossy massage, which was a revelation to them as a couple as well, because they realised, Ben was realising that he wasn't asking for what he wanted, and then out came some of Karen's desires, which she's sort of hidden, because she just went, I just wanted to pin him against the bed, but she felt she couldn't say that. So all of this just brought out some brilliant conversations, and now they have more relaxed sex, and they are also, having time for everyday sex, but also creating time for them to have some adventures as they would like to have adventures. So and creating time for what Barry Long calls love play, because I don't like the word foreplay because it means that we're waiting for something else, and actually we can just have great love play and it may not end in something like penetration. So just creating time where the pressure doesn't have to be on to have penetration for it to look like a successfully intimate, pleasurable time. They might just do some lovely erotic massage together. So all of it just took the pressure off. Couple more. Ellie came to me on one of my online courses that I run for women. No sexual confidence, always wondering if she was doing sex right. She couldn't relax at all, and she didn't like her breasts and she didn't like her genitals. So this whole picture was meaning she just wasn't getting any pleasure from sex at all. Pivotal things with Ellie was she saw that she wasn't her thoughts. She realised how critical her mum and her sister had been of her. And this was actually a revelation, because up till that point she was believing a lot of what they shared to be true. And no wonder she couldn't switch off her thoughts and was wondering if she was doing it right, because she'd just been brought up in a very critical family. It was a big breakthrough for her to realise that she actually deserved pleasure. That just was not in her makeup from her life. And just starting to say that for herself, she booked a little massage for herself. She took some time off to see a friend, when she'd been just working and working before that. So she learnt to enjoy the little pleasures in life. She also learnt how to communicate her needs and also learn what her needs were and as well. And she did some mirror work where she looked at her genitals for the first time after having 2 children, and with some time and practice realised that actually her genitals are absolutely healthy and natural. She even went and got a piercing because she was so excited, this new relationship with her vulva. And she did some breast massage. So she thought that her breasts, she didn't like how they looked, but I find doing breast massage is an amazing practice, because when women do breast massage, they realise they didn't like how they looked, but actually they feel great. And so she started to enjoy her breasts, and then the ideas of how they looked became less and less and less. She's now really enjoying pleasure in her whole life as well as her body. She's communicating her needs, got a new relationship, and amazingly her confidence has grown so much she decided to apply for a job which she'd have never applied for had she not done this work. She never in a million years thought she was going to get it. She got it, and she doubled her income. So it was just amazing just to share how how this impacts so many aspects of her life and our lives. And just a few little somatic examples as well, sort of more, because these were all more talk-based work with lots of education and practices. A client I worked with called Brian, of course not his real name, he came to me because he had problems with sex in marriage, where he just had very negative experiences. And so his sexual confidence was shattered by the time he got to me, and he was really scared about being with another woman. He'd been with his wife for 20 years. So I brought in a sexual surrogate. So he could practice just touching another woman again for the first time and take that pressure off the experience, but also get some real feedback, because his wife had told him that his touch was terrible, that he was rubbish in bed, and all these different things. And so by practicing with a surrogate, he was able to build his confidence so that he was then able to go out dating again in a really great positive way. And he'd actually had a few years away from dating because his fear of dating was so much after this experience with his wife. Molly was somebody who I did some work with the 3-minute game, just learning to ask for what she wanted. And again, just didn't realise that she could even ask for what she wanted, that was even a valid choice. And so just by practicing, I'd like this type of touch and feeling into her body, oh no, could you go slower, faster? Just amazing transformation. Sally had, she had vaginismus, the condition where the sort of muscles in the walls of the vagina tighten. And so she was so focused because of her experience on pain. And so, but actually, and so what we did was we worked together, we explored some of using the dilators together. When you get given the dilators, which are the little plastic tubes to insert into the vagina to see how you get little different sizes to work with the vaginismus, but often women are just told, there's the dilators, go and try them. She was too scared to do it on her own, but she didn't know where to turn to. And so when we talked about it, I did some sessions with her, supporting her to use the dilators, and actually using the dilators was just too much even for her at that stage. But she was able to, with my support, because of trauma in the past, and she didn't want to be on her own with this, she was able to just touch the outside of her genitals and find actually there was places where there was actually some pleasure. And this was a revelation to her. So just helping her to learn to receive pleasure from herself was the first step on her healing journey. But it was the somatic sessions that enabled that awareness and that experience for her. So that's just a little insight into what I do and how I work with people around pleasure. Please feel free to contact me if you've got any questions, and I've got a newsletter, YouTube channel with some videos and all sorts of different things on, so please feel free to come and visit my website, sign up to the newsletter, and I keep you posted with lots of lovely things. But also if you've got any questions, I'm really happy to ask them now, or feel free to email me as well.